y la amistad. En este edificio hay ahora un nuevo espacio. Es luminoso, es grato, es agradable y está el mejor amigo de usted, mío y de todos nosotros. ¿Sabe qué es? Un libro, muchos libros, una historia, muchas vidas que van a enriquecer la nuestra. Vengan a visitar la librería del Colegio Nacional.
Sí, me parece bien.
Cuarto encuentro, Libertad por el Saber.
Muy buenas tardes, me llamo Antonio Lazcano Araujo, soy biólogo, soy miembro del Colegio Nacional y a nombre propio, a nombre de mis colegas de esta institución, los quiero invitar a que participen, a que asistan al encuentro Libertad por el Saber que el colegio está organizando para el próximo mes de octubre. En particular, junto con mi amigo y colega, el doctor Luis Fernando Lara, estamos organizando una mesa redonda titulada Genes, Genomas y Lenguajes, en donde vamos a ver las consecuencias en términos étnicos y en términos lingüísticos del extraordinario proceso de mestizaje que se dio a partir de 1519, hace 500 años, cuando empieza este proceso tan complicado de la conquista, de la caída de Tenochtitlan, del arribo de nuevas culturas, del proceso de mezcla de tradiciones culturales, de genes y de lenguas. Y el propósito de la mesa redonda que estamos organizando el doctor Lara y yo es precisamente ver hasta qué punto podemos nosotros encontrar una correlación entre los distintos grupos étnicos, entre las composiciones genómicas, los marcadores genéticos y las lenguas que hablamos. Los esperamos el 17 de octubre a las 18 horas aquí en las instalaciones del Colegio Nacional. La entrada es libre porque, como ustedes saben, el Colegio Nacional es una institución de todos y para todos.
Del 13 al 19 de octubre, entrada libre, Donceles 104, Centro Histórico de la Ciudad de México. El Colegio Nacional te invita. Cuarto encuentro, Libertad por el Saber.
Mi nombre es Jaime Urrutia Fukuguchi, soy miembro del Colegio Nacional y es un placer el invitarles a que nos acompañen en el Encuentro por el Saber en octubre sobre 1519 a 500 años. En esta ocasión están caminados a presentar desde muy diferentes puntos de vista los acontecimientos de hace 500 años con el arribo de los españoles y de Hernán Cortés. Invitamos al simposio sobre el Valle de México, que estará formado por 12 conferencias. La que estaré participando es sobre la formación del Valle de México, la geología, el volcanismo y el clima. Y abordaremos diferentes temas dirigidos a entender la estructura profunda del valle y lo que ello representó hace 500 años y lo que representa actualmente, por ejemplo, en el caso de los riesgos naturales, la parte de los riesgos sísmicos. Esperamos verlos a todos por aquí. Muchas gracias.
Del 13 al 19 de octubre, entrada libre, Donceles 104, Centro Histórico de la Ciudad de México. El Colegio Nacional te invita. Cuarto encuentro, Libertad por el Saber.
Hola, soy José Ramón Cosío, miembro del Colegio Nacional. Los invito a participar en la mesa que junto con el doctor Pablo Mijangos tendré el honor de coordinar el próximo viernes 18 a las 4 de la tarde. La idea en el encuentro Libertad por el Saber es explorar las maneras en las que España y México, lo que entonces era nuestros reinos se encontraron y quiero conversar acerca de los encuentros entre dos mundos jurídicos, entre dos civilizaciones, pero desde un punto de vista estrictamente jurídico. Para ello he invitado al doctor Rafael Diego Fernández, miembro del Colegio de Michoacán y experto en estos temas, así como a la doctora Clementina Babcock, ella es miembro del Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, así como el profesor Pablo Mijangos del CIDE. Entre los 4 trataremos de explorar algunos de estos elementos de encuentro.
Del 13 al 19 de octubre, entrada libre, Donceles 104, Centro Histórico de la Ciudad de México. El Colegio Nacional te invita. Cuarto encuentro, Libertad por el Saber.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están todos ustedes? Soy Leonardo López Luján, arqueólogo y miembro del Colegio Nacional. Quisiera invitarlos a todos al martes 15 de octubre en punto de las 5 de la tarde a mi conferencia que llevará como título aquí en el Colegio Nacional Del deseo al desencanto, Cortés, el oro del Templo Mayor y el tesoro de Moctezuma. Es una conferencia que se realizará dentro del Encuentro Libertad por el Saber que llevamos a cabo cada año, en este caso la 4ª edición, y en particular mi conferencia hablará sobre cómo los metales preciosos fungieron como uno de los móviles principales de la conquista española. Tanto las fuentes históricas del 16 como los testimonios de muchos indígenas nos muestran cómo los conquistadores españoles preguntaban sobre joyas de oro, de plata en sus recorridos y sobre todo la ubicación de los placeres, es decir, de aquellos lugares donde el oro podía colectarse ya sea en polvo o en pepitas. Grandísima fue la sorpresa de Hernán Cortés y de todo su ejército cuando se dieron cuenta que en el actual territorio mexicano pues no había grandes cantidades de oro como los que existen, lo sabemos bien, en Sudamérica. Hoy día en países como Bolivia, Colombia, el Ecuador y Perú abundan los museos del oro y en México no los tenemos, simple y sencillamente porque nuestras civilizaciones indígenas de tiempos prehispánicos no tuvieron acceso a estos metales preciosos y les dieron un valor muy distinto al que le daban los españoles y al que le damos en la actualidad.
Del 13 al 19 de octubre, entrada libre, Donceles 104, Centro Histórico de la Ciudad de México. El Colegio Nacional te invita.
Tardes, a nombre del Colegio Nacional y de la Facultad de Ciencias, les queremos dar la bienvenida a la conferencia que hoy va a presentar el profesor John Dupré de la Universidad de Exeter. Esta conferencia, este evento ha sido organizado entre la doctora Erika Torrens, una amiga y colega de la Facultad de Ciencias de la UNAM, el propio Colegio Nacional, y tiene lugar porque tenemos la buena fortuna de que John Dupré, que es un extraordinario filósofo de la biología, visite la UNAM y se nos ocurrió, gracias a la generosidad de la doctora Torrens, que podría también dirigirse a un auditorio ligeramente distinto, que son los amigos, los estudiantes, los colegas y el público en general que viene al Colegio Nacional. Todos ustedes saben que la tradición que siempre se decía era que la historia de la ciencia era la historia de la medicina y la filosofía de la ciencia era la filosofía de la física. Y esto se refleja incluso en obras tan famosas como La estructura de las revoluciones científicas de King. Pero cuando uno lee a King, cuando uno lee a muchos de los filósofos de la ciencia de esa época, se da cuenta que hay una omisión enorme, que son las ciencias de la vida, que plantean situaciones y problemas muy específicos. John Dupré pertenece ya a esa generación de filósofos que enfrentan los problemas que plantean las ciencias de la vida, la biología en particular, bajo una perspectiva completamente novedosa. Esta perspectiva completamente novedosa incluye, desde luego, el carácter histórico que tienen las ciencias de la vida, que es algo que no podemos omitir en modo alguno, pero también, por supuesto, incluye el hecho de que la teoría central de la biología es la idea de la evolución, pero hay una serie de confusiones respecto a qué es lo que debemos entender como evolución. El darwinismo clásico, el neodarwinismo o esta mezcla que se da ahora que parece no tener una estructura clara en donde se incluyen problemas que van desde la deriva hasta la simbiosis, el transporte horizontal, etc. En particular, como todos ustedes saben, el neodarwinismo es una influencia que ha permeado de una manera extraordinaria la biología, la investigación en biología, la descripción del fenómeno de lo vivo y a veces este neodarwinismo ha quedado extraordinariamente reducido a la genética de poblaciones. La obra del doctor Dupré, analizando críticamente estas limitantes, es de una riqueza extraordinaria y yo creo que es una oportunidad para todos ustedes, para nosotros también, desde luego, de tenerlo aquí como conferenciante invitado. So John, you are most welcome here and we will be delighted to have the chance to be your audience this evening.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that. What I could understand of it seemed an extremely generous introduction, and I'm only embarrassed that I couldn't, and disappointed that I couldn't hear more. And I must apologize for speaking in English because you wouldn't understand a word if I tried to speak in Spanish. So, it's also, I should say, a great honor to be invited to speak here at this Colegio. It's a great pleasure to be here in Mexico. Okay, so my topic today is Neo-Darwinism. I want to say a little, which will be familiar to many, as to what this is. I shall present a little bit of a caricature of it, but I don't think a totally unfair one. And then I will say some things that I think are very problematic for it and try and draw some conclusions about how one should understand the very heated debate between neo-Darwinians and many critics or people who say that it's at least an insufficient view of evolution. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to offer a rather more radical story, I think, and I'm going to suggest that the underlying metaphysics, and I know I've been told that sometimes this word sounds very strange in a scientific context. And I know at home in England, if I go into the metaphysics section of a bookshop, I will find, all kinds of things about the ancient wisdom and how to leave your body and things like that. That's not what I mean. I just mean the very general picture of the world that we're trying to give a story about. So here's an outline, okay, good, of what I want to talk about. And sorry, some of my slides have too many words, but they may get better, I think. So I'm just going to outline this view of Neo-Darwinism, which derives from the modern synthesis of the mid-20th century. Say a word more about that later. I'm then going to point out a number of really interesting developments in biology in recent times that have shown real problems with the Neo-Darwinian view, and at least certainly the version of it that I would present. And then I want a question that I want to at least touch on is whether this should be understood as just a gradual process of scientific development, like any good science, advancing in a little bit here, a little bit there, or whether there's something more radical going on. And one of the reasons this question is interesting is that the debates about evolutionary issues are so extraordinarily heated. And this leads, I say, to the final part of my talk, where I'll offer a diagnosis, I think is a rather unstandard diagnosis of the debate in terms of this issue of underlying metaphysics. And in particular, I want to very briefly advocate a thoroughly processual view, and of course I'll explain more what that means later, of life, that I think makes it much easier to understand the kinds of developments that have taken place in evolutionary thinking. Okay, so the first part of my talk beyond Neo-Darwinism, I start off, and I'm sorry, this is a really crowded slide. I'm sorry if it's hard to read. But so here's what I mean by Neo-Darwinism. I also call it the hardened modern synthesis. Again, many of you, I'm sure, will know the modern synthesis was something that happened in the 1930s, the 1940s, in which people saw the way to reconcile essentially Darwinian natural selection with Mendelian genetics. And this was more or less widely agreed to be the way forward for evolutionary thinking. And certainly this was a very productive venture in evolutionary thinking, and produced all kinds of new insights. But I think there's a further part of the story that people more and more, many biologists came to see the kind of models, particularly models of population genetics based on the synthesis, as really the whole story about evolution. If we understood these models and we understood the way that, as I then in my further points, the way that selection, natural selection, worked on very small genetic changes, we really had the story, the important part of the story of evolution. So these theses, natural selection was seen to be overwhelmingly the cause of adaptation of the fit of organisms to their environment. And novelty was seen to be generated by small genetic mutations that gradually produce the major changes we see in evolutionary history. Insofar as inheritance, which of course is key to the evolutionary story, is important for evolution, inheritance was seen as being mediated by nuclear DNA, the DNA in the center of cells. And this was the only important kind of inheritance. And though everybody, most people at any rate, could see that natural selection worked directly on organisms, that is, organisms that live or die, animals and plants, nevertheless, a conceptual structure was introduced over time, and this is in the later phase that I'm talking about of more recent Neo-Darwinism, the hardening of the modern synthesis, in which the selection of organisms was only important as selecting the genes that lived in them. The genes that lived in them produced the features of organisms that made them visible to selection in good or bad ways, and what ultimately was selected were the genes. Now, I guess many of you will have read the very famous works of Richard Dawkins, and if you have so, you'll know exactly the view I'm talking about. Richard Dawkins certainly didn't invent these views, but he has popularized them in ways that have been enormously influential. My thesis is that this set of ideas has become increasingly a problem for the development of evolutionary theory, and an obstacle to progress. And I'll obviously say more about that as the talk develops. Okay, so here are some revisionist theses, which I take to be very inimical to at least what I call the hardened modern synthesis. Natural selection, first of all, I want to argue, is not the only course of adaptation. And though I'm always a little unwilling to claim Darwin as a kind of authoritative source, this is certainly something that Darwin believed. There are several ways in which traits can be inherited that are important for evolution. A third point, which I haven't touched on, but the idea that everything in evolution is really traceable to natural selection has fostered an idea that evolution is absolutely essentially a competitive process. Nature red in tooth and claw, as saying once went. That we should really think of the whole process as one of violent competition, which has very little place for competition, for cooperation. I want to argue that this is a mistake, and that cooperation is actually an extremely important process in evolution. And indeed, the next point is actually the most controversial in some ways, that acquired characteristics can often be inherited. And it takes a little bit of understanding why this is so controversial, and I think perhaps it's impossible to understand properly why it's so controversial. This is what's often called Lamarckianism, and is the ultimate taboo in orthodox evolutionary thinking. And I suppose one of the ideas is that people think this understates the power of natural selection, to suppose that we need some kind of acquired characteristics. It values the contribution of the new synthesis that showed how these small changes could produce big adaptive changes. Finally, I want to say there are various sources of novelty, and I want to make, here I've highlighted in green, what I take to be an absolutely banal thesis, but one which sometimes seems highly counterintuitive. Selection creates nothing. Selection is a filter. Selection cannot create. Selection can only choose between things that have been created somehow or other. And again, I'm afraid I have a slight habit of quoting in a not totally positive way Professor Dawkins, but I think one of the unfortunate impressions some of his books give is that natural selection can create anything. Indeed, so powerful is it that it will always create the ideal solution to any problem. I just want to say that contrary to this, natural selection creates nothing. Now, of course, it may be that a sequence of tiny changes can create the big changes we see, and that's, but selection didn't do that. Selection had those little changes to select. Okay, so the first of these revisionist views I wanted to mention is probably now not that controversial. There is a lot of inheritance that is not genetic. And a classic book on this topic by Eva Jablonka and Marianne Lamb, Evolution in Four Dimensions, are pictured up there, describes this in a lot of detail and marshals a great deal of evidence for the importance of these various kinds of inheritance. And I also want to say, following also their work, all of these kinds of variation are heritable. They can be passed on from parents to offspring, and given that fact, they're all potentially sources of evolutionary change. So I'll run quickly through a couple of these, particularly, and this is a very topical idea, epigenetic inheritance. Epigenetics, I'm sure many of you know, is any molecular cause of gene expression other than the sequence of nucleotides in the nuclear genome. It's this sequence that orthodox Neodarwinism sees to be absolutely fundamental to evolution and indeed to biology. And partly because of the idea, which I will come back to a little bit later, that somehow the genome sequence fully determines the final phenotype, the final outcome of the organism. But in fact, we now know there are at the molecular level, there are a lot of other things that determine just what the nuclear genome does. And these include DNA methylation, which is just a little marking of the genome sequence that determines the extent to which that particular sequence is expressed, modification of the structure that the genome, the chromosomes are wrapped around, the histone proteins, and also increasingly attention to small RNAs that exist and can be passed on in the maternal cytoplasm. A crucial point here is that many epigenetic changes are inducible by the environment. And this, of course, raises an alarming possibility. If the environment were to induce adaptive traits, and these were heritable, then we have inheritance of adaptive acquired characteristics, the heresy of Lamarckianism. Now, come back to some of that. Cultural and symbolic inheritance, again, is largely uncontroversial. Cultural inheritance systems are clearly important to many species. And I'll just give one fairly randomly selected example because it's been very thoroughly studied. The nut cracking technology in chimpanzees that learn to crack nuts by essentially putting them on a flat stone and bashing them with another stone. Here's a little map of part of Africa in which this technology exists. And I'm not going to go into the details, but if you look, you see that you're more likely to have this technology if you live near other chimpanzees than have it. It spreads from one group to another, presumably by them imitating one another. So it spreads sideways and is found typically where you have nearby practitioners. And there are many places where all the resources exist for this technology, but it hasn't yet arrived. So this is something, it's adaptive. It's pretty clearly good for chimpanzees to be able to open nuts in an efficient way. It's adaptive. It's inherited. It's inherited from parents to offspring, and it's passed laterally from one chimpanzee to another, sometimes a chimpanzee in another group. So this is something that happens in many species. It's been documented in I mentioned primates, cetaceans, birds, rodents, fish, many different kinds of animals. In some cases, generally very intelligent animals, it's passed on through explicit teaching. And I could go into what that might involve. More often, probably simply by imitation. Animals see one doing something useful and they copy it. And of course, there are multiple human examples: language, religion, diet. All of these things you could draw maps, rather like the one that I drew, of how these cultural practices spread around. And of course, we know that they're translated from one generation to the next. Again, if these are adaptive responses to the environment, and in this case, surely they are, I mean, they wouldn't spread if they were not adaptive, but also one assumes that often, and there's some kind of insight in an animal that sees that this would solve its problem, they will result in inheritable, acquired, adaptive characteristics. Okay. Now, there's a common reaction to all of this, and it basically, the bottom line is, yes, this stuff happens, but it's really not important. If we're interested in the grand sweep of evolution, this is just a little rather trivial noise on the surface. And in support of this, people will say, well, these changes are less stable than genetic changes. They don't last really through evolutionary time. To which one, of course, asks, well, how long is long enough? It's certainly true that many epigenetic marks don't survive the process of reproduction, but there's clear evidence that in some cases there is, in fact, multi-generational epigenetic change passed down over many generations. Now, how many do you need for this to be evolution? I don't think there's any simple answer to that. I often think in this context, and again, I'll probably stop apologizing, but there's a wonderful, those of you who have read Richard Dawkins' most famous first book, The Selfish Gene, may remember that there's a chapter early on called Immortal Coils, suggesting that DNA lasts forever, but nothing lasts forever, right? I mean, this is at least not in this world. This is very strange. And I almost feel there's some, well, I speculate on this for a while, but I will just say, clearly there's a time scale. But the other, I guess, crucial point about this is, yes, one set of epigenetic marks may decay over generations, but of course, these may be being reintroduced. And it turns out that one of the most classic studies of epigenetics is a perfect case study for this. And this is work by the biologist Michael Meany on rats. And it turns out that, and this seems to be very well documented, that rats lick their babies, and if they lick them a lot and they lick them in the right kind of way, the babies become calmer and more, lead generally more relaxed lives. Now, the obvious consequence of this is that their babies are more relaxed, and being more relaxed are likely to spend more time licking their babies and producing more relaxed grandbabies to the first ones. So in a sense, what you have is an inheritance process that passes through the environment. And of course, this is very likely adaptive, because if the environment is relatively safe, it's probably a good idea to be calm and relaxed and spend time licking your babies. If the environment is very dangerous, you shouldn't be relaxed. It's a bad idea. You want to be totally on edge, looking out for predators and so on. And so this practice would not be transmitted. Okay. Now, just moving on to a second part of the kind of criticism, there are many sources of novelty in evolution. The first is perhaps not obviously important at the first pass. Most evolutionary theorists now believe that there is selection at many levels of organization. The selection of genes, though one might argue that this is only in special cases where genes have abilities to pursue their own interests at the expense of the organism. More generally, the selection of organisms, and it's widely believed, at least, that the selection of groups of organisms. But this, I mentioned this interactor-replicator framework. The idea then would be, whether it's an organism or a group, it's just an interactor, a vehicle. It's just something that the genes make happen, and then as it happens, and if it's adaptive, it furthers the genes. So this can be assimilated. A much more complicated problem, to which I'll say a little bit more about this, is plasticity. basically what plasticity says is, contrary to the picture I just a moment ago sketched, it just isn't the case that genes, the genome, determines what the organism will be like. Organisms respond to their environments, often in ways that are adaptive, and develop differently from how they might in other circumstances. And I'll say more about this in a moment. I'll pass quickly on a question of the smallness of mutations. This is a long-standing debate. A classical moment in the debate was the argument by the brilliant but eccentric biologist Richard Goldschmidt, who had the lovely idea of hopeful monsters, some monster that had a great big mutation and probably died, but imagined some world in which this would do it good. There's often an argument, again, on the from neo-Darwinists that there really can't be big mutations because, remember I said, organisms were perfectly adapted to their environments. If you're perfectly adapted, you don't want to make a great big change because you're going to be much less adapted. Very soon you'll be selected away. But this is just not obviously true, certainly once you get rid of this very strange idea of optimal adaptation. I mean, it's hard enough to live in the world at all without being optimal. Optimal is a very tall order. And if you're not optimal, you might get something that makes you much better. And, so it might be that if you're a pig, suddenly growing some small wings on your back would just be a nuisance and get broken when you rolled over in the mud and so on, and you would be less fit and you'd be selected against. But maybe if you were a very small, mousy little animal and you grew these wings, you'd suddenly find that you could fly, and this is a sort of silly example, but the point I hope is clear, that in most cases a sudden change in your anatomy will not be a good thing, but nevertheless it always might be. In the real world, there's a topic that I will only touch on in which this has become much more salient. This is in the area of evolutionary developmental biology, where a lot of attention is paid to regulatory genes, genes that contribute to shaping the overall architecture of an organism. Now, if you make a mutation in these, you might have a very big change in the overall structure, maybe even grow wings on your back, and this might be a good idea. But I'm not going to talk about this. This would be at least another lecture. The thing I want to talk more about in this lecture is symbiosis or symbiogenesis. Symbiogenesis is usually used quite narrowly to refer to the enormously significant events that, as was famously argued by Lynn Margulis, happened in very early evolution. Most famously, the appearance of the eukaryotic cell through essentially the engulfing of one cell by another. And of course, this was the ultimate macromutation, big change, and all the large organisms you see on the planet are descended from perhaps just this event, perhaps there were several events of this kind. Much more generally, though, and this is more my topic today, are symbiotic systems. And as I'll come back to in a moment, nearly everything in biology is a symbiotic system. And there's a lot of quite technical debate about whether this is possible. It's possible for these to be selected over in an evolutionarily relevant way. Another crucial point, at least, that comes out of the importance of symbiosis is this point I made earlier about competition and cooperation. And as I've already said, traditional neo-Darwinist thinking tends to think everything interesting comes about through competition. What symbiosis points to is one area in which this is just wrong. Cooperation is everywhere. in this case, between different kinds of organisms, but also, I mentioned group selection, there are many organisms that cooperate massively among their own species. I mean, we are one. We couldn't possibly, perhaps the most spectacular case, though we might sometimes compete and we might sometimes fight with one another, we couldn't possibly survive in the modern world without the division of labor that enables us to function in this complex environment. So obviously, some people produce my food, my clothes, construct spaces that we live in, and this is a massively cooperative enterprise. One can also look at the social insects as a similar kind of example. Okay. So just back for a moment to symbiosis. Symbiosis is everywhere in the living world. I mean, we've all probably heard now of the work on human gut bacteria. And of course, there are also skin bacteria and mouth bacteria and bacteria in essentially all the surfaces and cavities of the body that are increasingly realized to be highly functional, important to our thriving. And another very fundamentally important case is the symbiosis between plants and fungi, which again is a topic that one could dwell on for a long time. One of the most fascinating aspects of this is that the mycelia, the threads of fungi that actually penetrate the roots of plants, actually appear to link up and connect different plants together, not even plants of the same species, and can transfer nutrients between plants. So this is a process that not only points to the symbiotic necessities of the individual tree or flower, but to the way that they may be interlinked into wider cooperative systems. And there's another interesting range of realm of investigation into the symbiotic bacteria of insects, which are very well studied. What's particularly interesting about many of them is that the insects have become entirely dependent on the environment of the insect that they live in, and even are transmitted from one generation to the other within the maternal cytoplasm, so that they've become part of the inheritance systems, the vertical inheritance systems of the insect. So this is everywhere. I mentioned a moment ago phenotypic plasticity. This is something else which we find everywhere. Organisms develop with plastic responses to their environment. Here again, I kind of the classic work, very long book full of countless illustrations by Mary Jane West Eberhardt. The question, of course, is whether this evolutionarily matters, because it might seem this is just an individual organism's response to its environment and will be lost over time. However, this may well not be the case, because there are many processes described, often under the label of genetic assimilation, which suggests that actually, if you have a plastic response to a changing environment that continues, the environment stays a certain way, the organisms over time continue to respond in a particular plastic way, this may come to be something that happens genetically, i.e. the genes that more easily produce this plastic response will be selected, and gradually to the point where that particular form comes even without any environmental response. And this is, as I say, a topic that's been discussed for a long time within biology. There are many types of plasticity. I have a kind of rather simple-minded attachment to the idea that these are most important in particular groups of organisms. So in bacteria, we have metabolic plasticity. What does this mean? Well, bacteria typically live in multi-species communities in which actually the division of chemical labor is spread across the community. And this is something that essentially where whatever resources you have for the bacteria to feed on, you will tend to get assemblies of bacteria that form to use these resources by producing the various genetic resources that are needed to do this. In plants, plasticity everywhere is morphological. The shape of plants will depend on the available light, it will depend on the kind of space around it, the kind of plants that are growing around it. And in animals, a great deal of the plasticity is behavioral. Animals learn to behave differently in response to their environment. And of course, this fades into the topic of cultural evolution that I already discussed. Of course, I want to make clear that these distinctions are not by any means sharp. For one thing, animals have lots of morphological plasticity, and I give you on the slide one example, a dog born without front legs that learns to walk upright. And in fact, as a two-legged dog develops, all kinds of substantial change in its physiology come about. The shape and structure of the hip is quite different in a two-legged dog that spent its life walking on two legs. Maybe this is the kind of thing that wouldn't necessarily do well in the wild, but still, it shows you that the organism has resources to respond in this kind of plastic way. So I want to suggest that all of these kinds of plasticity can provide novelty for selection. And of course, given that plasticity is largely about adaptive responses in development to the environment, this is another source of the somewhat dreaded Lamarckian inheritance, Lamarckian evolution. Okay, one other thing I haven't mentioned, but I want to briefly touch on in this part of the talk, niche construction. Neodarwinism is a story of of passive response of evolving species to their environment. But this, it turns out, is not what typically happens. Organisms shape their environments. They have a two-way interaction, and they construct environments that suit them as well as being suited to their environments. They are not passively tracking environments that they encounter. Again, I give you one of the classic, more recent works on this. Just a few examples. Here, my only other reference explicitly to Darwin, his classic work on earthworms and the way these more or less aquatic organisms live in soil by maintaining the soil by the process of importing organic material into it, maintain it in a moist enough state that they can still thrive in it. And Darwin did lovely little experiments on earthworms. There are other, of course, extreme cases like the beavers who build their dams that essentially construct a whole environment for them to live in. And then the most extreme case, ourselves. And obviously, one part of the environment we construct is sort of schools and hospitals that are very obviously involved in our development. But of course, the whole, urban environment, probably don't need to say, in the middle of Mexico City, is a huge construct designed by generations of humans to provide the resources for human life to survive. Now, so just to kind of wrap up this part of the talk, a lot of this is often referred to as the extended synthesis. And this is essentially the idea that all of these provide minor modifications to the basic modern synthesis model. And of course, it's very hard to say how many modifications you can make and still have what it was you started modifying. And perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about questions like that. But if I were to pick from my own field of philosophy of science what I think is really a better story about what's happening, I would suggest from the great philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, the idea of a degenerating research program. It's a set of central ideas which can continually accommodate new discoveries, even refutations, by making ad hoc hypotheses and adding a little bit here and a little bit there. But where obviously this is not really progress, this is hanging on to a kind of fading idea. And I think that even this expression, the extended synthesis, encourages this sort of hanging on to an idea that's really in decline, and would be better to open ourselves up to thinking much more broadly about evolution. With which I turn to the second, slightly shorter, I think, part of the talk, in case you are concerned. And this is, I want to talk about the metaphysics I mentioned in my introduction, and what it is to have a process view of metaphysics. I want to say, I guess I've really said all of this, that this really heated debate, and I could tell you an anecdote if I have time, about just how heated this is, really reflects the need for a more satisfactory underlying framework of what we're really talking about. I want to say that the Harden synthesis in particular, as at least an extreme version of what I've been discussing, reflects a mechanistic metaphysics. And I'll explain what this is in a moment, but I want to say the mechanistic metaphysics was hugely invigorated by the discovery of the structure of DNA in 1953, which indeed launched a program of work in molecular biology of a kind of mechanistic kind that was enormously productive. And so it's probably a good thing that we carried on doing this. But nevertheless, I think even in molecular biology, there are more recent findings that show that we really needed quite different metaphysics. And I will try and explain all of that. So let me go back to the dawn of philosophy, at least the dawn of Western philosophy, of the kind of the tradition that I was trained in, which starts with the Greek, the pre-Socratics. And the pre-Socratics, the ancient Greek philosophers, had a lot of strange views, and some of them were very contradictory of one another. And here are two of the most famous figures. Parmenides, who was famous for saying, change is an illusion. There is no change. It's just something we see. And Heraclitus, my own hero, who said, nothing endures but change. Actually, what he really said, there is nothing but change. Everything flows, in a nice expression. Now, I think it's a little unfair to Parmenides at this point, because it sounds stupid. How could there be no change? We see change all the time. We see, we change. We see our friends change. We see the climate change. We see all kinds of things change. The spelling out of this view that I think is more relevant is of people, several of other pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly Democritus, who says, nothing exists except atoms and every empty space, essentially. So how does this spell out the Parmenidean view? It's really saying, what really is important are the things that don't change. And the world that we imagine is insignificant, of changing, complex changing things, is really just the rearrangement of these underlying fundamental things, the atoms. So obviously it takes a lot of atoms to make an animal, but essentially what you have is atoms arranged into little temporary structures, and these into bigger structures, and eventually you get something like an animal. But it's all that really exists are these unchanging constituents. And my second slide for the history of philosophy, my second and last slide, I want to say Parmenides won. he won particularly in the scientific revolution, where the atomistic worldview that everything was just rearrangements of atoms became the dominant idea that fueled Western science for several hundred years after, and I give a quote from Boyle, but I could have given a quote from Descartes or from Locke, similar sort of things. Essentially, we're looking at understanding everything in terms of the fundamental things, the unchanging things, and explaining away change in these terms. And I want to suggest that Parmenides' victory, perhaps disaster is too strong a word, because clearly the centuries of mechanistic science have produced a great deal of value and significance. But they have, I think, because in the end they're the wrong way of thinking about the living world, the problems from this view build up and lead us into ever more kind of misunderstandings and inability to see some things that are really important and happening. So let me try and explain a little bit more about what this difference is. So I was going to say, so I think I've said all of this really. The mechanistic view is this bottom-up explanation. One is always explaining wholes in terms of parts until one gets down to the atoms. What I want to say against this is that mechanistic models, mechanistic pictures of the world, are not the truth about the world. They're abstractions from something more fundamentally dynamic. But if you take the methodology of mechanism has been very successful, as I said. If you take the methodology just directly to reflect what is the underlying metaphysics, you think there's a world of static things built up into this pattern of bigger things. And I want to say there are no such static things in living systems. And I guess this is the connection with what I said before, the most fundamental connection. Neodarwinism is a classic example of mechanistic thinking. And again, if you recall, those of you who have read Richard Dawkins, nothing really has agency, causal agency, except the genes. Everything else is built up out of the genes and then feeds back onto the genes. So it's a wholly reductive program of explaining what looks as if it's happening at the higher level in terms of the lower level. So what is the difference between a thing and a process, if that's not a rather obvious sounding question? What I want to particularly emphasize with this is that, in a sense, what the difference isn't. The difference isn't that processes may not be stable parts of the world. So a lot of the world, and much more than people think, is actually composed of stabilized processes that look like individuals, that look like things. So here I have a mountain which looks very like a thing. It sort of, just sits there doing nothing. Now, of course, as is perhaps always the case, this is really just a matter of time scale, because if you're interested in the time scale of geology, mountains rise up, maybe volcanically, are eroded by wind and rain, and they're a process. But you certainly hope it's not a process when you're climbing it on a nice sunny afternoon. You hope it's very much a thing. But there are stable parts of the environment that are not like that at all. And here my paradigm is the Great Red Spot on Jupiter. People have observed this spot for hundreds of years. It stayed there more or less the same, though it changes a bit. It gets bigger and smaller and things, but it's there. But it is not just there because nothing's happening. It's there because all kinds of winds and flows around the area where it is maintain this stable arrangement. It's a kind of eddy or vortex on the surface maintained by all this movement. If the movement stops, it just goes, it's finished. It's gone. So this is what I call a processual individual. It's a kind of process, but it's a kind of process which is displayed as a relatively stable structure. Now, another of these full of words. So processes persist through activity, whereas if you're a thing, an ontology of things, a world of things, the default condition is stasis. And this leads to what I think is the most fundamental actual practical method, practical implications of this process view. Because we think of a world of things, we tend to think that what's important is to explain change. Why does the thing stop doing or being what it is and become different in some way? Now, of course, we're interested in that, whatever kind of individuals we're talking about, but when you see things in terms of processes, what is actually even more fundamental than that is why they stay the same, why a process persists through time. And this is something that absolutely cries out for explanation. I have a quote here from one of the more prominent recent process philosophers, Nicholas Rescher, who said, "As process ontologists see it, enduring things are never more than patterns of stability in a sea of process." And that's, of course, the great red spot is just exactly that, a pattern of process, a pattern of stability. What a thing is consists in what it does. And of course, it's important that stabilization, unlike just being there, just inertia, is not a perfect process. Processes change all the time, but within parameters that they remain the same stabilized process, if you're lucky. Okay. So a question within this context for evolution is the ways in which living systems may have inherent tendencies for adaptive change, for change that maintains their stability. Here's how I think we should think about life. As a hierarchy, as the traditional mechanist sees, but rather than seeing this as a hierarchy of things made up of smaller things, we should see it as a hierarchy of things stabilized in important part by other, well, I should say things, I should really say processes, but one can't talk without the thing word. So I give one example that's the simplest example. If you look at the heart, you might think of this as just a structure made out of cells or molecules that kind of forms a sort of machine. But the machine is not something that just sits there, kind of machining away and doing what it does. The heart maintains its stability in part because its parts are doing the right things. It has cells and molecules in it behaving in the right kinds of ways and tissues, but also because the heart is embedded in a larger system which is equally crucial for stabilizing it. A heart doesn't last very long if you take it out of an animal and just put it in the fridge. If it's to maintain its stable activity as a heart, it also has to be embedded in a living organism. And the organism we all know we're supposed to exercise to keep our hearts working properly. But far beyond that, the body has to keep pumping blood and nutrients through the whole system, which of course it only does because it is beating. So you have constant causal interaction between the part and the system. The part is even being constantly rebuilt and regenerated by the system, and it's embedding in that system as well as the particular structure of components it has that maintains its integrity, if we're lucky, over quite a number of decades. This two-way causation. So it's quite different from this bottom-up picture of everything being made out of these little bits of Lego that fit together into ever bigger structures. Now, organisms, I sort of think it's obvious, are processes. In fact, they are simultaneously three different kinds of processes And this raises some interesting questions that I mean, how these fit together that I won't talk about now. But we are metabolic processes. As we all know, we are systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium, maintained in a stable state by constantly drawing energy or stuff from the environment and fueling trillions of chemical activities every second within our bodies. We are also developmental processes. We are not actually typically, we're not ever, no organism is just a certain way all the time. It actually has a life cycle and goes through a characteristic series of stages, which is another process. And finally, as I've already mentioned, we are collaborative processes, and all, or almost all organisms, or at least living systems, the systems that are stable and survive through time, are such collaborative processes. One of the crucial things about why I like to stress this collaboration is because these collaborating systems are deeply intertwined. They're not really separate things, just contributing to some joint activity. They're mixed up with one another in a sense in which it makes it really hard to draw boundaries around and say where the system begins and another system ends. So, for example, I mentioned the bacteria that live in insect cells that only live within them, that are passed down through generations within those cells. Are those parts of the cell, or are they alien beings that can only live there? It doesn't really matter, but there's a sort of question that if you're thinking of processes sustaining one another, stabilizing one another, it's not a problem, but it's very hard to think of things in this way. And one of, as I say, drawing boundaries within a flow of process is always a somewhat arbitrary activity. And so I give the example of a river, which was Heraclitus' most famous example. You may remember the phrase, everything, you never step into the same river twice. Heraclitus says, so if you look at the river, what's the difference between a river and a tributary? Which is which? How many tributaries are there in a complex system like this? When is it a lake or just a wide bit of the river? Where does the lake end and the river begin again? These are just questions that don't have answers. This is just a flow of process which we divide up in various ways. So this leads me finally, and I hope I'm not going long over, to the metaphysics of evolution, lineages as processes. So what is it that evolves? I think we know the answer to that. Lineages evolve. Sequences of organisms, groups of organisms, and their offspring. If a group of organisms that are part of a lineage has different properties at one time from another, then it's evolved in a certain way. Now, there are many kinds of lineages, and the traditional answer to what evolves has been species. There are some little technical problems about these. The most important for my interest being that some organisms, like bacteria, probably don't really form species at all, but I'll put those on one side and just say, let's talk about species as the lineages that evolve. And I've got a definition from George Gaylord Simpson, one of the biologists involved with the modern synthesis. A lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role. It's what evolves. What's a species? In my discipline, probably one of the most famous ideas in the last 50 years, 50, has been that by the philosopher David Hull and the biologist Michael Gieslin, that we should not think of species as classificatory terms, as a way of classifying the biological world, but as naming individuals. I actually think we should do both, but I won't go into that now. But for now, what's relevant is thinking of species as individuals. And the crucial point, I think, is that actually undermines many of the reasons people resisted this idea, is that we tended to think of individuals as things. But species are not individual things, they're individual processes. Evolution is the change within processes of this kind. That's, I guess, my answer to the question, what is a species? What is evolution, or at least where does it happen? It happens within lineages, which are a kind of process. Some of the reasons why people are worried about this, the parts are discontinuous. That's not a problem for processes. Classic examples of more familiar processes, I see things like battles. The soldiers don't all have to be touching at the same time. They can kill each other at a distance. The space in between isn't really part of the process of the battle. They have ambiguous boundaries. There's the question of symbiosis. There's the problem of hybridization between species that make the boundaries less than clear. And they have no continuous properties. A species that evolves linearly for long enough may have very little or nothing important in common with its ancestors. It doesn't matter. It's the same process because it has the same connections, the same kinds of causal connections. Organisms are processes, then, I want to say, of self-organization and self-maintenance. Why shouldn't species be similar? And the obvious objections aren't objections to the individual processes idea. And indeed, I think we can sort of find an answer in David Hull, who I mentioned as one of the architects of this idea. Most organisms exhibit more internal organization than most species, but it's a difference of degree, not kind. And not every species has the sort of level of organization of a species like our own, but plants aren't as organized as animals, and it's just, again, degree. This is, again, characteristic of processes. Processes can be highly organized, they can be totally disorganized. So, there's chaotic activity or the sort of organization of an animal like ourselves. And organisms and some species, to some degree, construct their individuality and maintain their stability. And this is, I'm getting very near the end. The question I said you should ask of a process, not so much why it changes, but why it doesn't, why it stays the same, what stabilizes a species. And really what I want to say is actually, and this is probably, might be the most radical thing I'm going to say, I think this is the really important role of natural selection. Not as an agent of change, but as an agent of stability. It's what makes it possible for individual lineages to survive over long periods of time by, of course, constantly maintaining only those individual organisms that, in a wonderful, rather outdated phrase, satisfy the conditions of existence. And as I mentioned earlier, satisfying the conditions of existence, staying alive, is pretty much of an achievement without trying to be the best possible. Clearly, lineages, all the members of lineages that leave ancestors stayed alive, satisfied the conditions of existence, and were not pruned too soon by natural selection. So, this is the crucial thing that stabilizes species. And there has, over the years, been quite a lot of talk about stabilizing species, sometimes stabilizing selection, sometimes it's just a little thing that happens when nothing interesting is going on, but sometimes as what's really important to focus on. And that's what I think we should think of doing. There is more to stabilizing species. I mentioned niche construction. What's niche construction? It's the construction of the conditions of existence that the organisms can survive in. So this stabilization is both maintained by selection, but maintained by maintaining an environment in which a certain kind of organism can continue to thrive. And of course, reproduction of new members of the species, new parts of the lineage, broadly construed to include all the forms of inheritance that I mentioned. There are many further issues. To what extent are species discrete, integrated processes? And if they are those, what further processes integrate and individualize these processes? What I really want to say here is we should be very pluralistic. Species are highly diverse processes. And I want to say, in the case of bacteria, probably when I said maybe there aren't any species, what I really meant is there aren't any integrating processes apart from natural selection. What does natural selection do? Essentially, it provides a map of the conditions of existence such that certain areas of it are highly privileged and certain spaces in between are not. So we maintain distinctions between different kinds of bacteria, but that's about all there is. There are no processes of interaction between the members of the species that contribute to their integration. And because of this and because of the kind of multiplicity of interactions involving bacteria of very different kinds, most notably the flow of genes between them, this is a very loose kind of even set of conditions of existence, and there's a great deal of arbitrariness about how we define the species or even the kinds of bacteria. By the time we get at the other end of the extreme to sexually reproducing animals, we have very clearly defined individual lineages. And of course, sexual reproduction has been greatly emphasized in this, sometimes as defining species, because it does indeed provide this integration by maintaining the gene flow within a particular group of organisms and excluding all other organisms to a degree from it. But of course, it's rather an anomaly that we should have defined species in terms of a process that most species don't actually partake in, i.e. sexual reproduction. I think we can understand this in terms of the process view, where sexual reproduction is what actually makes some species so integrated and so genuinely individual in their nature. So I say increasingly integrated species also provide a growing number of potential sources for evolutionary change, and also make possible cooperation as something that emerges as the species becomes more integrated. Obviously, we want to, if we do think some species become highly integrated individuals, do they have properties? Do they have distinctive capacities? And one obvious thought there is the capacity of evolvability, which is something that evolutionary biologists have been very interested in lately. Does evolvability evolve? Well, I want to say probably it does through the development of these integrated lineages that allow many of the kinds of processes I was talking about earlier in the talk. That leads me slightly longer than I meant, but not much, to conclusions. So I want to say all the main theses of Neo-Darwinism have been somewhat problematized by recent biology. The view remains attractive because it fits with a reductive mechanistic worldview that emerged with the scientific revolution that has been very productive and is thoroughly embedded in the scientific process. If we are to advance our thinking, I suggest that we actually need to replace this and rather think about evolution in terms of these processes within which evolution happens. And I guess what I said earlier was my most radical view in this. I think that one might well think of these. Remember, I also said that processes inherently change. So evolution as change maybe isn't actually even something that we need to explain in a systematic way. If we have these integrated processes that are stable through time, that persist, they're going to change. They're going to have various ways of adapting to a changing environment, and they're going to persist only as long as they satisfy the conditions of existence. But it may be that there is no pattern or single process to evolutionary change. We should rather look at evolutionary stability, lineage stability, as the most fundamental phenomenon. I end with one little advertisement, but if you're interested in the process view I've very briefly outlined, this is the place to look for it. And I'm very pleased to be able to do this self-promotion of a book that is actually free. So I'm not asking you to buy anything. This is pure open access, thanks to my soon-to-be no longer friends in the European Union who paid for it. And so this is where you can find more about that. And with that, I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for this provocative set of ideas and very articulated lecture. Tenemos tiempo, desde luego, para preguntas, comentarios. No tenemos tiempo para otra conferencia de parte del público, desde luego. Pero son bienvenidos para hablar. Don David, por favor.
A ver si me hace usted favor de lo siguiente. Genéticamente, a nadie, bueno, primero el primer punto de reflexión. Yo, por ejemplo, no se me ocurriría tener sexo con mis hermanas o con mi madre. Normalmente es la moral de todos, pero hay excepciones. Por ejemplo, hay políticos que nos recalcan mucho, que vienen de padres maestros, lo recalcan mucho, y son unos raterazos. ¿Hasta dónde llega, hasta dónde podemos asumir o hasta dónde podemos palpar de que la parte genética la moral tiene una parte genética importante, cuando sabemos que en la práctica todo eso se quiebra, vamos, no se respeta? Entonces, creo que debemos de ahondar más en los problemas sociales con la base que usted maneja, con la investigación que usted tiene, porque la verdad nos confunde mucho y no tomamos el camino adecuado para evaluar y para poder salir de tantas crisis que tenemos.
I think it's just sufficient to say I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you that the place to look for explanation of morals is not in genetics. I think that the processes I talked about in cultural evolution are where to understand the extent to which there is any evolutionary story to be told, and that it's sometimes may be helpful there to tell an evolutionary story, but not a genetic story, not about the moral.
Thank you, John. Sí, Don Omar.
Thanks. I have a question. I can understand what is, in your way, the difference between a change and a transformation.
Change and
change, yes, and a transformation. I can understand the difference from your point of view.
Maybe you could say more about where I made such a distinction. I fear it may have been an accident. Where did I say transformation distinctly from change?
¿En qué parte de la conferencia él mencionó la transformación como diferente al cambio?
Well, from my point of view, maybe I'm wrong, when you speak about evolution in a traditional way, we say transformation when something happens with previously things existent. Now, a change is when you take a new thing than before never existed. It's a different, two ways. It's not the same thing from what is a change and what is a transformation. And you only use the way transformation. No.
So is your question whether I want to say something different about origins, like origins of life? I don't think I said anything about the origins of life because I didn't want to. Now, of course, it's a very important topic, but I think, like Darwin, I hate to claim the mantle of Darwin, but like Darwin, I will see, that seems to me a possibly separate issue. Now, of course, many people have evolutionary theories about the origin of life, chemical evolution, and so on, but I really didn't want to speak about that. I certainly hope very much that it would fit within the kind of picture I'm giving, but I don't have a view about the various chemical theories of early chemical evolution. Okay, so.
Don David, por favor. Sí.
Thanks a lot for your lecture. Thanks indeed. I would like to ask you about your position of the natural selection theory in the evolutionary process. The importance of this, because in many of your examples, it looks like there is a function. For example, in the dog walking upright, mm-hmm. Looks like there is a function for the dog, mm-hmm. or the symbiosis process. Mm-hmm. Is it really important to explain the evolutionary process? Because, for example, for the extended synthesis, if not, we are not changing the things that Darwin said about the adaptation and the natural selection. We are just saying the process of how the characteristics are inherited to the next generation. Thanks.
I'm not sure if I quite got your question. I mean, there's a question, so you start off talking about function, and of course, function is often explained by natural selection. Part of what I want to say about this is, in certain ways, I mean, function is explanation of structure, just as structure is explanation of function. But I think that the point perhaps I would be most helpful here is, it isn't a mystery that the organisms that exist are fitted to their environments. That's a truism, right? So now, of course, the process by which we got to this huge array of organisms is a really interesting one, but it isn't part of the mystery of that process that the organisms that exist are functionally adapted. That's part of what we're trying to explain. There would be nothing to explain if organisms weren't adapted to their environment. It could be that they're adapted to the environment by a lot of individually distinguishable processes that produced particular features of them. But that's just one hypothesis. It could also be that if we find there exist these processes that have this considerable robustness over time, robustness means that the members of them continue to be adapted to their environments, that the lineages, that's to say, the members of the lineages, just wander around adapted space in maybe sometimes pushed in different ways. If I were to really spell this out more closely. I'd probably distinguish between different levels at which selection works. So I think it's unproblematic to see, and this may be what looks like Neodarwinism, the fine-tuning of lineages to their environment as being a rather classically selective process. In the sense, I mean, that's what it does. The better ones do better, and if there's an optimal, so things optimize, like size optimizes, because there's constant pruning of ones that are doing less well because they're too big or too small to be best suited to the environment. But this is the day-to-day housekeeping of lineage survival, rather than substantial changes in lineages. Those substantial changes don't require, I think, a selective explanation. They may perfectly well just be this wandering through the very narrow space of adaptiveness, i.e., meeting the conditions of existence.
Don David.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. ¿Sí me echan la mano con la traducción? Sí. Me gustó mucho la analogía con la montaña. Y una de las cosas que decías acerca de por qué ha funcionado mucho el programa reduccionista es que ha dado un montón de resultados, ¿no? O sea, una gran cantidad de resultados. Pero creo que también tiene que ver con la simplificación de la realidad, ¿no? O sea, muchas veces no podemos estudiar las cosas como un proceso, aunque nos gustaría. Y en ese sentido, mi pregunta es, ¿cómo acoplas esta idea de los procesos a las hipótesis de trabajo para que no se quede nada más en algo que tenemos en la cabeza a la hora de realizar nuestros experimentos, sino más bien como una cuestión metodológica y como una cuestión realmente de qué podemos hacer para integrar esta nueva visión a nuestro quehacer científico, ¿no?
Okay. Thank you. That's a great question that I can't answer in great detail because there are many different aspects to it. I think that, so one part of it is, of course, is explaining, one part of it is explaining why the mechanistic approach has been so successful. A very simple story I have is mechanisms are abstractions from the processes, and they're more or less successful to the extent that the constituents of the mechanism that you distinguish are ones that are stable enough over the time of the process you're interested in. But I think the more interesting and difficult part of your question is, how would we do, I think, if I understood, how would we do science really taking seriously a process view? I think there are many possible, there are developments in biology, there are people in systems biology trying to do this, I think. Some, not all by any means, many are, much systems biology is also just huge reductionism with big computers, but you can try and I think some people are seriously thinking about this in that way. I would also say that the methodological point of focusing on stability rather than change can be important. I mean, I wrote a paper with a cancer researcher, and again, this is only really just a clue. I don't know how to do cancer research, but that a starting point for cancer research is the real question is why we don't get cancer, not why we do, i.e., given the massive division and differentiation of cells in our body, how could it possibly be maintained in a functional way rather than very small changes leading to many of the conditions we call cancer? So, when I hear somebody say we really need to understand the cause of cancer, that seems just a crazy question, right? There couldn't be a cause of cancer. The whole of human development and metabolism is, in a certain sense, a wonderfully successful fight against cancer. So I think, whether this, how much it helps us. I mean, sometimes it just helps us to think differently, to remember that the mechanistic framework we're working within, even if it's to some degree successful, is only a simplification of what's really happening, and then maybe at least an inducement to think of the larger processes that may be going on around what you're looking at. But having said all that, I think really my main point is, I guess that's my main point is, it's good to try and think about what's happening, even if the immediate reaction is just to throw up your hands and say, that all sounds too complicated. Maybe it is too complicated, but we can still carry on trying.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. Just to clarify my mind, in one of your first slides, you say that natural selection just select variation. And I completely agree with that. But the accumulation of that variation produce new structure. So how and this structure did not exist before natural selection. So how do you call this process?
Evolution.
Good. Yeah, but that means that natural selection can produce new structurals.
Natural selection can be part of the explanation of change in a lineage, but it is never the origin of novelty in the lineage.
Yeah, speaking about variation, yes.
Yes. Okay. Variation is
only variation,
is a question entirely distinct from the question of natural selection.
Perfect.
Is that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Ladies first, Pepe.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I was thinking about this distinction you make. On the one hand, you show this very reductionist and mechanistic perspective about more focused on things than on processes. And on the other side, the process view. And when you showed that slide with the philosophers, you showed that so like somehow I don't know whether it was a somehow intermediate view, but that there are some things that are to some degree things or fixed things that are somehow mixed in different ways, and you get to different things.
Right.
And I'm very interested in things so like in the evolution of development and things like heterochrony or things or processes where different developmental programs, so to say, appear in different places of the organisms. And there seems to be, to some extent, things that are relatively fixed, but that are mixed up in different ways in something that you could call a process of stabilization. To what extent can you talk only about evolution, so like about the process view, and to what extent are there some things that are relatively fixed?
Are relatively?
Fixed. And so like things.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm certainly drawn to the view that nothing is absolutely fixed. But of course, the mountain is relatively fixed. Something I didn't really bring in, but is crucial to more articulation of the view, is timescales, that there are very different timescales for fixedness. So, I mean, if we're talking about the molecular biology of the cell, there are things that are fixed for small fractions of a second that exist very transiently. If we're talking about astronomical objects, they may be pretty fixed for, hundreds, millions of years. So there's fixedness is an important and highly variable property of more or less integrated parts of processes. I know, probably doesn't get, there's an awful lot that could be said there, but that is the first thing that comes to mind as a starting point with your question.
Pepe.
Thanks for your insights on the topic, John. I was wondering, also on one of the slides you were mentioning that we are making a metaphor, or are we making a metaphor, or are we saying that it is so when we are equiparating epigenetic inheritance with Lamarckism?
Oh, well, so if by Lamarckism you mean the views of Lamarck,
yes,
then indeed we're making a very big jump, because Lamarck didn't really say things terribly like this.
And can we extend this conclusion to any kind of acquired characters inheritance?
But let me just finish where I was. I mean, I think Lamarckism has come to mean the inheritance of acquired characteristics. I mean, just as Darwinism has come to mean something about the, all-powerfulness of natural selection, which, of course, Darwin was evolutionary pluralist of just the kind I support. No doubt there are many things he wouldn't agree with. But so I think one's got to, maybe I should make this clearer. Darwinism and Lamarckism are modern concepts with very loose connections to their historical origins. So all I mean by Lamarckism, and I did at least, I don't think I even mentioned this, but all I mean by that is inheritance of acquired characteristics. So inheritance of adaptive acquired characteristics, more than that, worse than that. but that's...
Don Omarci.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Doctor, for your talk. I have one question. You mentioned symbiosis, and you mentioned symbiogenesis, and I love them. And I think that those two, or actually symbiogenesis, is at the very center of the origin of lineages and the origin of species and other things. So it is very important. So what do you think? Most biologists, or many biologists, are reluctant to accept it or mention it and incorporate it into the debates. And the other is, do you think that philosophers, science philosophers, do really understand symbiosis? Because Margolis is alive more than ever. So what's your opinion? Why we are so reluctant?
So I guess the second part of your question, do philosophers understand it? I think that's not a question for me. I think I understand it a bit, but I may be rudely corrected. Rudely not meaning impolitely, meaning just painfully. I think it's very important. I think that so there are two questions. One is, how widespread is symbiosis? I think maybe you're using symbiogenesis a little more broadly than where I was just, and I'm very happy with that, by the way. I have no problem with that. So you're suggesting the idea that a great deal of evolutionary change comes about through some kind of cooperation, or something between cooperation and merger of existing organisms. I think that's a very attractive idea. And I think I sort of alluded to it, but could have probably highlighted it more without going against what I believe. Then you ask, why is it so resisted? This, I think, is absolutely a paradigm of what I think is this problem that the new synthesis, the modern synthesis, has created in its kind of almost sort of slightly fossilized version, a kind of ideology that is really resistant to important new ideas about how evolution works. And it's very hard to say exactly why that's true. I mean, one can tell stories about how people, famous people who spent their youth working out great new population genetics models might be told, well, actually, population genetics only describes rather unimportant parts of evolution, maybe, possibly. But I mean, I think it's very extraordinary the degree to which these ideas are resisted, and I can only confirm that they are. I mean, and maybe I'll tell a story I alluded to. I think may well be on public records. 2 years ago, I was one of the organizers of a conference. It was a rather high-profile conference between the British Royal Society and the British Academy on recent developments in evolution. And this was approved by the committees of the Royal Society and of the British Academy. These are the two, and I suppose they're the equivalents of where we are now, the two most prestigious academies in Britain. The conference was sort of getting going, and then it came to the attention of some members of the Royal Society. And 20 fellows of the Royal Society wrote a note to the president of the society saying that they'd heard this conference on essentially the extended synthesis, new trends and evolution. And they were appalled. They said, what is the Royal Society doing hosting a conference like this? This is bringing the society into disrepute. This was, and I quote, this was similar to the society hosting a conference on astrology. I mean, jaw-dropping stuff from famous scientists. And I mean, certainly, and this was a conference, just I say, talking exactly the things I said today about epigenosis, about symbiosis, about plasticity. I mean, you know, these well-discussed developments, and just say this should not even be talked about in these hallowed halls. That's extraordinary. So this doesn't answer your question, but there are so many things. I mean, obviously, I think partly it's this mechanistic story is a bit of it. The battle with creationists is another bit of it. You know, I mean, here again, I can say, you know, that there's I say things like this, and I get lots of not terribly welcome enthusiasm from creationists who say, yes, now we see it. The evolutionists can't even agree on their story. And I can say, that's the point. That's the difference between science and ideology. But the irony is that it's partly in response to that, the science becomes more and more ideological, dogmatic. I don't have an answer, but it's a fantastically disturbing and strong phenomenon.
Before giving the mic to this gentleman over here, I think there's a certain level of sociological component in these arguments. When Lynn Margulis published her 1970 book on symbiosis and cell evolution, the book was not very well received in the USA. The reception in Latin America was extraordinary. So I think there is, it's something that you always have to take into account. That, for instance, it's very well known that in Russia, Darwinism was never developed to include the idea of competition, whereas in the Great Britain and in the USA, the idea of competition was dominant. And so I think there's a certain social component that one should always keep in mind.
Absolutely, that's a great point, and of course, yes, the complexity internationally. I mean, when you mention Soviet Union,
Russia,
Russia,
not the Soviet Union, which is quite different.
Yes. Yeah. But what I immediately think of then, of course, is Lysenko, and the trouble with Lysenko is he just wasn't very good at his job and was interested in. But the ideas were not stupid. Indeed, the vernalization of corn is a totally plausible epigenetic
epigenetics,
process.
absolutely,
Perfectly well. It probably did have some
value.
He just wasn't the most inspired scientist.
But I think that component has always to be taken into account.
Absolutely.
In 1970, Lynn Margulis also published her very, very famous Scientific American paper on symbiosis. And it really spread through Latin America in a wonderful way. Not because we are more open-minded than the British scientists or students, but simply because I think that the way people look at evolution was different. And I don't want to imply any religious component about it. I think that most of the arguments about the rejection of evolution and so on have to do with debates between the US, between the USA, UK, a little bit of Germany. But for instance, in Spain or in France, the situation was completely different. I mean, the French have a very long tradition that started with the Lumière brothers, with the Fred Lumière, accepting the idea of symbiosis.
Right. Okay.
So,
yeah. That's a very, very important point. Yes.
Yeah. So one minute.
Thanks, John, for your presentation. I just had a very brief comment and a question. As a historian of science, it always strikes me that when speaking about modern sciences in relation with Neodarwinism, Alfred Wallace and August Weismann, they were not present at some point of your presentation, considering that at least those two guys were pushing for the idea that natural selection was the only mechanism for explaining evolution, they pushing for adaptationism, etc. And it's always about Darwin in that sense, about the history of evolution. And well, that's just a comment.
So it's not about Darwin.
Well,
not about that. Sorry, that's what you said.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, absolutely, yes.
Okay. And just a very quick question. When you were speaking about the extended synthesis and the problems to consider such an extension of a previous theory, such as Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism, are you implying at some point that we need to begin to consider that this is not an extension, but a new synthesis, a new theory of evolution, or something like that?
I guess I would prefer to put it as not so much of replacing one theory as another, but replacing one kind of totalizing theory with a much more pluralistic view of evolution, being open to many changes that are, many processes that are important within evolution. And indeed, I mean, here I am somewhat inclined to call on Darwin as as somebody who actually was a pluralist of that kind. But that's how I prefer to put it, rather than replacement of one theory with another. This isn't so much a theory. I mean, the metaphysics is a sort of theory, but the evolution, the message I want to give for evolution is more pluralism than this rather than that.
I believe, see.
Doctor, thank you for your presentation. Since you have said that organisms and also species are a conjunction of metabolic, developmental, and collaborative processes, where to put in this scenario the viruses, in this Neo-Darwinism scheme? For example,
to put what?
Viruses.
Viruses.
I mean, do they have one virion, for example, has individuality?
That's another great question. Thank you. I've actually written a little bit about viruses as processes. And viruses are, of course, ones that are wonderful case of processes, because the structural stability does not survive the life cycle. The process passes through a cell and essentially dissolves into discrete chemical activities going on in different places. So it's only if you focus on the virion, the stable state, does a virus even begin to look like a thing, right? If you follow the life cycle, it's wholly processual. I think the question, actually, this is something I really want to work more on, but the question of the role of viruses in complex biological systems, I think, is just beginning to really attract the appropriate attention. I strongly I would be very surprised if the kind of almost revolutionary growth in interest in bacteria as symbionts doesn't very soon bring in viruses. I mean, I also, as well as the symbiotic one, I think it's really interesting. One of the things which, again, is kind of a bit neo-Darwinist is the idea that DNA in all the interesting ways, is kind of vertically transmitted. And then there's this annoying thing that bacteria sort of pass it about sideways a bit when you're not looking. But, this is just only bacteria, and they're only silly little things, as Mayer used to think. They were sort of contemptible little organisms. But, of course, bacteria are just mobile bits of DNA, and so viruses. And once you really take viruses and other kinds of mobile genetic units seriously, you realize DNA isn't just something that moves vertically. We live in a great wash of DNA coming through us, and some of it sticks. And this is very destabilizing of a lot of the way people think. So I think viruses are of course, there's lots of virology going on, but it's still, as far as integrating into the wider sphere of biology, I think this is one of the really exciting areas.
Por favor, don Omar.
Professor, many authors that are a part of the idea of natural selection, of the modern synthesis, are being very politically right. They all maintain the idea of natural selection. Scott Gilbert, for example, says that natural selections affects the holobiont instead of the organism. But with all these new research programs that biology has acquired, how much time do you think that the idea of natural selection will endure?
So I'm not sure. There were some different questions going on there. But hello. You started off with a question about the politics, the political. Maybe I'll just say something about that. Political economy and biology have been exchanging ideas for at least since Malthus, I'm sure, much earlier. And this is a very important interaction. I think I'm very reluctant to say, it's very tempting for me to say, Neo-Darwinists are a bunch of right-wing extremists and they should be suppressed. But I don't really believe that. I think that lots of, hardline Neo-Darwinists are very decent human beings who just have got the biology wrong. Of course, ideas are almost always open to appropriation for political purposes. And I think is fair to say that extreme selectionist evolutionary theory has been particularly well adapted for being appropriated for what would strike me as very undesirable political purposes. But I don't think it's intrinsic to the theory. Still less do I think that all the people who promote the theory are bad people. So it's a very complicated story. And of course, there is, we are biological organisms that evolve as well as being political organisms that contest political ideas and so on. So, they're inherently connected to some degree. So it's a very complicated story.
Thank you.
I myself have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I was somehow troubled by your statement that you see inherent tendencies for adaptive change. That sounds a little bit like a drive, like an inner drive for adaptation.
Within lineages or within organisms.
But how would you define or find those inherent tendencies? Or could you provide an example of that?
I suppose to some degree much of my talk was about this. Mostly the inherent tendencies in lineages are to some degree dependent on the inherent tendencies in organisms. The plasticity, the adaptive plasticity of organisms, if there are indeed mechanisms like genetic assimilation, are tendencies that exist within a lineage to produce adaptive change. So that would be one strong example. Possibly the evolution of evolvability is an example of producing new ways of adapting. Cultural evolution,
to
the extent
that's quite different. Yeah,
I mean, so many of these things are inherently adaptive processes. So this is the idea that as we evolve lineages that are more integrated, coherent, cooperative, and so on, we are also evolving processes that are more apt to produce this kind of adaptive tendency.
Implying that in different types of living beings, you will see different kinds of these inherent trends to...
Yes, absolutely.
Namely?
Well, I mean, so all of these ones, like let's take that one extreme, cultural evolution, which only occurs in quite complex animals, to, on the other hand, bacteria in which nothing like that exists, and in fact, maybe really there is nothing but natural selection maintaining the structure of bacteria.
Oh, no, they wouldn't hold, because in bacteria you have the lateral gene transfer going on at an extraordinary level.
Right. So is that certainly, for example, if I talk to soil scientists, they do seem to have
that's a wonderful example,
an adaptive view of lateral gene transfer as the tendency of communities of bacteria in a particular area to, as it were, be looking for genetic resources from other parts of the system. But here, I'm tempted to go in a more conservative direction and say, but that may just be a process of sampling whatever passes through, and if there's lots of throughput, the right genes that propagate through the system will show up. As lineages become more complex and sophisticated, it's more likely that active processes of looking for the resource that you need in that situation are going to be articulated in some way. So that would be...
I see your point. Not that I agree completely, but I do see your point. The other question has to do with the people that have sort of have gone in the same direction that you summarized today. For instance, one can go from ideas that were basically useless to biology in a specific way, like René Thom's idea of catastrophe theory.
Yes.
And Prigogine, who never went beyond the level of very general description, but I think was an opening of the very hardcore physicists going towards the idea of dynamic systems. Yeah. And then I can think directly of Oparin, who, just to quote Heraclitus all the time, with the pantarei in Greek, everything moves, with a very... I hate to say the word because it's so charged by now, the term, but it was a very dialectical, materialistic perspective of life as a process. That was his main argument throughout his life, except when he was close to Lysenko. That's quite the hardening of Darwinism was the only source of variation were point mutations. And you had at the same time this reductionist trend from molecular biologists. But I would say that nowadays this has changed enormously.
Has it? It's changed the molecular biologists?
Oh,
how much has it changed in the evolutionists?
Oh,
I mean, it is changing, of course.
I can tell you from my own experience in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Mexico, in Latin America, our definition of evolution is not only natural selection, but includes in a very natural way symbiosis, lateral gene transfer, epigenetics. And I think it's, I could not give you an explanation of why this is so, but I think that the community, the young community is accepting those ideas in a much more natural way, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I'm very pleased to hear this. I mean, that's
yeah.
I have just one comment on your very helpful comments. I guess I'm slightly less embarrassed to introduce the term dialectic. I find, I mean, of course, you know, the great ancestors, apart from Engels, are learned in
Hegel.
And, well, Hegel, of course, but I mean specifically in biology, of course, Engels' Dialectics of Nature was, but then Lewins and Leventin in their dialectical biologists. But I think this is actually such a powerful idea for biology. I mean, everything, like almost all of these issues, or very many, are like the environment and the organism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's hard to find a better word than dialectical from the way in which these construct one another. And throughout biology, I think, this is at least a good name for what happens. You could say the name has been slightly corrupted with other associations.
Yeah.
But the basic idea of mutual interaction, mutual construction, you know, I mean, that has such usefulness.
Well, I think with that remark we can come to an end.
I'm sorry?
So we can come to an end.
Okay.
So thank you so much, John. Muchísimas gracias por su asistencia. Y yo quisiera muy sinceramente agradecerle a mi amiga, a mi colega, a la doctora Torrens, la generosidad con la que propuso que el doctor Dupré nos visitara hoy aquí en el Colegio Nacional. Esta es su casa. Como ustedes se han dado cuenta, en lugar de tener el viernes de la evolución de octubre, tuvimos el lunes y el martes de la evolución. Y el último viernes de la evolución de este año, que correspondería al segundo viernes de noviembre, vamos a tener una segunda mesa redonda sobre dos biólogos absolutamente extraordinarios que estuvieron en México y que dejaron una herencia fascinante desde el punto de vista de los naturalistas, que fueron Bonpland y Humboldt. En esta ocasión vamos a tener a la doctora Irina Podgorny, que está con una posición doble en Berlín y en Río de la Plata, y al doctor Carlos Montúfar, que es el presidente de la Universidad de San Francisco de Quito, que con mucha generosidad, él es físico, pero se ha introducido mucho a la biología y con mucha generosidad está dejando acceso a los papeles de su familia, porque él desciende del que fue el mejor amigo de Humboldt en América Latina, que fue don Carlos de Montúfar. Muchas gracias, buenas noches. Thank you so much again, John.